He hung out with Nancy during her last known night on the town, and he's supposedly the guy who gave her a ride back to her place right before everything went completely black. Whenever you're dealing with a calculated kidnapping, that last window of contact is everything, painting a picture of what the bad guy knew when they figured it out and how they pulled off the perfect timing. Taking all of this into account, we're way past the point of treating this like a simple whodunit with a straightforward answer. It started off as a surface level puzzle about the identity of the guy in the mask, but now it's a deeply complex game of chess. Who had the inside track to pull this whole nightmare off flawlessly? This perfectly illustrates how the public perception of this entire investigation has completely shifted over time. While that initial terrifying footage remains etched in our minds, it no longer exists in a vacuum as fresh evidence has emerged to weave an even more complex and baffling narrative. Law enforcement officials are convinced this was a calculated hit, and they are fairly certain they understand the underlying reasons behind it. Detectives are actively hunting down potential co-conspirators, even though one highly publicized clue involving a discarded piece of handwear ultimately led to an absolute dead end. Relatives woven into those final hours were thoroughly scrutinized and cleared of suspicion, yet they remain deeply scarred by the tragedy, forever tethered to the victim's last ordinary moments in New York. Ultimately, this is exactly the profound emotional space where our film finds its anchor. We are not leaving you with a neat resolution or a final courtroom judgment, but rather with a chilling inquiry that feels far more sinister than our initial premise. Because perhaps the most deeply disturbing element of Nancy Guthrie's sudden vanishing was never simply the terrifying reality of a disguised intruder showing up on her porch. Instead, the true horror might have emerged the very second authorities started viewing this as a deliberate, calculated ambush, shifting the core mystery away from the stranger captured on camera and pointing it directly toward the unseen mastermind, orchestrating things from the shadows. We are left wondering who possessed this dangerous information, how it circulated, and if the victim's innermost circle subconsciously felt the impending doom long before it made national headlines. To this day, the beloved woman has not been found, and law enforcement has yet to officially identify any specific person of interest. The police narrative remains riddled with massive holes, and until those gaps are permanently filled, this entire investigation will continue to radiate a profound, lingering sense of dread. It leaves us with a haunting realization that while a physical disguise concealed the attacker's identity, the most devastating truth was likely buried deep within that chronological chain of events all along. Renowned DNA expert CeCe Moore has successfully untangled over 300 complex mysteries, and she is absolutely convinced that advanced family tree tracing will ultimately uncover the truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Everything about this investigation takes a massive turn this evening, especially since the public has spent months fixated on a single horrifying picture regarding the tragic vanishing of Nancy Guthrie. Security footage captured a disguised individual slipping through the shadows with a singular, chilling purpose, and that specific visual completely dominated the entire narrative for a very long time. That visual dictated how the media talked about it, fueled the community's terror, and drove the single burning inquiry that was on absolutely everybody's mind. Everyone wanted to figure out the identity of the disguised suspect, yet we have to wonder if there was another crucial angle we completely missed. Imagine if the actual turning point stems not from that unknown intruder on the video, but from the victim's innermost circle, revealing a deeply unsettling betrayal that originated from within her own household rather than from a total stranger. We are officially moving past the basic home invasion theory this evening because we are now examining a scenario that is incredibly sinister and deeply chilling. There is a genuine chance that the sequence of events, the bizarre quietness, and the specific things Savannah said are leading us toward a reality that nobody watching from the outside is ready to accept. That new trajectory points straight into profoundly intimate territory, dragging the focus right onto Annie while simultaneously bringing Tommaso back into the spotlight. At this exact juncture, the narrative elevates way beyond a simple whodunit, involving a disguised phantom lurking in the dead of night. It transforms into a complicated puzzle centered on inside information, physical entry, perfect scheduling, and pre-existing dread that was brewing long before that intruder ever walked into the camera's view. If you manage to peel back the superficial layers of this investigation and look deeper, the moment you break your gaze away from the disguise and focus on the individuals who were surrounding the victim right before she went missing, the entire framework of this mystery alters completely. All at once, the chronology of events seems off, the lack of public statements feels highly suspicious, and the peculiar phrasing Savannah utilized during her interviews takes on a whole new meaning, specifically her shifting rhetoric, the precise details she highlighted, and the crucial facts she deliberately avoided mentioning altogether, all of which stops resembling standard mourning and instead comes across like a person trapped in the center of a reality that is far too risky and devastatingly agonizing, feeling like a secret she simply could not articulate out loud. That is exactly the starting point of our film tonight, launching not with absolute proof or a final judgment, but with a monumental change in perspective. This pivot compels every single one of us to seriously question if this ordeal was genuinely centered around an unknown assailant in the first place, or if the real narrative all along is focused on uncovering which insider possessed the necessary intelligence to facilitate that horrific event. Therefore, I need you to hold on to one specific thought as we dive deeper into this rabbit hole together. Assuming the victim's sister truly started suspecting that the culprit was part of their own circle despite everyone's denial, what glaring evidence was she observing firsthand while the rest of the world merely received disjointed rumors? Because introducing that concept completely revolutionizes the entire investigation. That disguised intruder absolutely holds significance. Yet the tight-knit group of relatives surrounding the victim during her last moments is equally critical. We also have to scrutinize the complete lack of communication, the exact chronology of the evening, and the highly specific vocabulary her loved ones utilized during their televised interviews. The deeper we start digging into those particular clues, a pair of highly distinct narratives begins to emerge from the chaos. The first avenue leads straight to Savannah, highlighting the distinct probability that her darkest doubts were never actually focused on a random outsider. The second route guides us directly to Tommaso, examining his ability to enter the home, his physical closeness to the crime, and his involvement in the evening schedule, which could be way more pivotal than initially assumed. Two distinct paths, a single bloodline, a solitary vanishing, and a horrifying theory that plunges this ordeal into unprecedented levels of darkness. The true nightmare might not actually be the visible assailant captured on video, but rather the terrifying secrets harbored by someone else long before that suspect literally walked into the shot. Since you are already tuned in, I highly encourage you to stick around till the very end of this explosive episode. As we peel back the intricate layers of this mystery, it becomes glaringly obvious that this was never just an arbitrary evening of senseless violence. Instead, it increasingly appears to be a tragedy orchestrated through intimate familiarity, highly questionable actions, and complex relational tensions that the general audience has yet to truly grasp. The ultimate starting block for our deep dive relies on one game-changing query, wondering exactly what prompted Savannah to suddenly harbor profound distrust toward her very own sibling. In order to fully comprehend the origins of such a shocking and painful accusation, we absolutely must revisit the initial narrative presented to the masses, where an 84-year-old resident vanished from her Tucson property during the early morning hours of February 1st, prompting officials to declare it a blatant kidnapping. Crime scene investigators discovered forensic evidence perfectly matching the victim's profile, spattered directly across the exterior entryway of the residence. Once law enforcement managed to salvage the home security video, society was introduced to the haunting visual that would permanently brand the investigation, depicting a disguised and heavily equipped intruder standing right on her doorstep, whom federal agents officially characterized as an average-built male standing between 5'9" and 5'10" tall, sporting hand coverings while lugging around a dark-colored Ozark Trail knapsack. There is a completely valid justification for why that specific snapshot struck absolute terror into the hearts of so many people. It basically served up an incredibly straightforward narrative containing a clear-cut bad guy, a logical investigative path, and an unknown phantom who seemingly breached the perimeter just to execute a calculated strike before evaporating into thin air. The vast majority of armchair detectives naturally pause their sleuthing right there, because that kind of cinematic imagery makes the mystery feel perfectly packaged, immediately tricking your mind into pointing at the screen and confidently identifying the true monster. Everyone collectively assumed that hunting down that specific individual would effortlessly provide all the long-awaited answers to this horrific tragedy. Real-life investigations are practically never that neat and tidy, and the biggest hazard of heavily relying on a striking piece of visual evidence is how severely it limits our collective ability to think outside the box. A viral piece of footage tends to force an entire nation to fixate so intensely on the visible suspect that they entirely forget to ask a much more subtle and insidious question. We have to figure out how that perpetrator pinpointed the absolute perfect time to strike, which is the exact monumental pivot this entire film is about to take. We are certainly not moving past the disguised intruder, since his involvement remains absolutely crucial to this entire investigation. However, we must also shift our focus toward an equally significant factor, which is the sheer likelihood of someone having intimate behind-the-scenes awareness. In situations resembling this one, detectives look way beyond simply spotting suspects on camera, digging heavily into who actually held crucial information regarding the victim's daily schedule and exactly when she was completely by herself. They desperately want to figure out who possessed enough familiarity with the layout to plan an entry route, alongside realizing precisely which surveillance devices were operating and how to bypass or completely shut them down. Authorities also heavily question who grasped the reality of her advanced age and physical frailty, understanding the incredibly narrow time frame they had to operate before friends or relatives sounded the alarm. Asking these specific types of questions absolutely does not guarantee that a relative committed the crime. While they fail to establish a coordinated plot or completely rule out a random intruder, these inquiries fundamentally shift how we must evaluate the entire investigation moving forward. You are suddenly forced to view this situation not merely as a simple kidnapping, but rather as a puzzle centered around privileged information, suddenly making specific details carry significantly more weight. Let us look at the primary detail, which is that Nancy's final confirmed sighting occurred on January 31st, right after her son-in-law, Thomas Oconee, drove her back home following a meal shared with him and Annie, serving as a verified timeline detail openly confirmed by the local police rather than mere gossip. On its own, that particular detail indicates zero illegal activity, yet during any disappearance probe, establishing the ultimate verified interaction remains critical, since it marks the exact boundary where an ordinary evening transformed into a complete mystery. This crucial milestone clearly pinpoints the very last individual who officially laid eyes on the target while she remained entirely unharmed. Such details allow law enforcement to establish the critical danger zone, mapping out the precise hours when the target was completely isolated, highly vulnerable, and devoid of any protective oversight. That specific juncture is exactly when the unfolding narrative takes a decidedly disturbing and deeply troubling turn. Whenever you attempt to determine if the disguised suspect struck by sheer coincidence or followed a meticulous plan, the ultimate exchange, the ride home, and the exact chronological sequence become monumentally important, pinpointing the absolute second that Nancy transitioned from the safety of her relatives to sitting completely solitary inside her residence holds an immense amount of significance. Detectives certainly do not kick off their inquiries at that point simply to throw immediate blame onto the relative who saw her last. They initiate their timeline tracking from that exact moment simply because every seasoned and competent detective follows that standard protocol. Adding an entirely new layer of complexity to this already tangled web is the simple fact that the official police maneuvers, or at least the ones visible to citizens, actively manage to project a pair of entirely contradictory narratives simultaneously. Looking at one perspective, Sheriff Chris Nanos eventually announced that the entire Guthrie clan, covering brothers, sisters, and in-laws, were officially eliminated as potential culprits, while actively labeling any public accusations against them as incredibly heartless. However, shifting to the flip side, Local cops were visibly scouring the residential streets surrounding Annie and Tommaso's property, actively requesting home security clips from nearby residents. Furthermore, the visible police presence swarming that specific subdivision became heavily documented by the general public incredibly early on in the investigation. Multiple bystanders noted uniformed cops operating right around the couple's household right on the 7th of February. They were spotted returning to those same streets on February 10th, actively chatting with locals and diligently scrubbing through their security doorbell recordings. This underlying friction holds immense weight since the community absorbed a distinct verbal narrative claiming the relatives were victims, while simultaneously witnessing a totally conflicting visual reality on the ground. Detectives clearly possessed enough justification to keep knocking on doors, scouring the area, and piecing together travel patterns that orbited dangerously close to her innermost circle. Whenever such contradictory events unfold simultaneously, widespread doubt naturally skyrockets across the community, though it certainly does not mean that executing a warrant equates to absolute guilt. It certainly proves nothing definitively, yet it heavily implies that the hidden mechanics of the probe were nowhere near as simple or clean as the general public desperately hoped they were. This exact dynamic is precisely how Savannah weaves herself into the narrative through a significantly murkier lens, serving neither as a definitive red flag nor as a sibling openly throwing her sister under the bus. You will not find any documented open declaration where Savannah explicitly points a finger at Annie, making that specific technicality extremely crucial to keep in mind. Yet the actual focus of this film zeroes in on something heavily rooted in psychology, carrying a much quieter undertone that ultimately provides significantly deeper insights than any straightforward allegation could ever manage. We are dissecting the sheer likelihood that her outward demeanor slowly started shifting right alongside the unfolding developments of the police work. During the initial days, the relatives projected an incredibly desperate push for rescue, loudly tossing their voices into the abyss as though Nancy might still walk through the front door. Their emotional appeals were aimed directly at whichever unknown individual was currently holding her captive. By the 24th of February, Savannah declared that their household was putting up to $1 million on the table to locate her, simultaneously admitting to the world that Nancy could actually be deceased, blending outright optimism with sheer terror, while mixing terminology meant for a rescue with words signaling closure, stands as the most psychologically telling pivot in the entire saga, largely because how we speak evolves whenever our internal comprehension shifts. Occasionally, such an intense mental pivot stems from confidential police updates, whereas other times it simply originates from overwhelming psychological burnout. Often, it blossoms from the sudden realization that the narrative fed to the media falls drastically short of capturing the entire truth. Once the general audience began paying significantly tighter attention to the specific phrasing Savannah utilized, a few listeners started questioning if her sorrow mirrored a child screaming into the void, or if it echoed an individual gradually realizing that the actual danger was much closer to home than originally suspected. We are not declaring a final verdict with that observation, but rather pointing out the genesis of a trend, one that grows increasingly sinister. The second you pivot back toward the disguised intruder and pose a query that the majority of viewers completely overlooked during their initial watch. Did this individual navigate the space clumsily like a complete outsider? Or did he stride with the confidence of a person perfectly familiar with his exact surroundings? That pivotal inquiry drives the entire next chapter of our narrative, carrying immense weight simply because the security tape can easily be interpreted from two wildly opposing angles simultaneously. Looking at one perspective, the guy caught on the lens appears incredibly composed, lacking any signs of panic while avoiding a blind, reckless charge onto the property. Federal agents confirmed that he arrived packing a weapon, concealing his face, rocking protective hand gear, and lugging a dark-colored Ozark Trail knapsack right as he strolled onto the victim's porch during the early morning hours of February 1st, prompting officials to eventually distribute further evidence. Detectives released the visual media convinced this individual played a major role in her vanishing. Watching those clips immediately triggers a singular realization: this guy was incredibly calculated. It makes perfect sense to feel that way, considering his calculated steps and flawless execution. He hardly resembles a bumbling amateur taking a wild guess, but rather a professional executing a precise strategy. Staying objective is crucial here, especially since the lead investigator firmly shut down a popular rumor surrounding those clips. Chris Nanos clarified that they found zero proof of this particular suspect casing Nancy's property beforehand. Internet sleuths had unfortunately already spun that baseless theory into absolute truth. Drawing that line matters immensely, meaning we shouldn't be asking if he had visited the property previously. We simply cannot know that, so the real question becomes whether his sheer audacity points to something deeper. Did his precise execution suggest he possessed intimate knowledge of the home, pulling the entire investigation dangerously close to the family? When it comes to residential kidnappings, having inside info rarely means the perpetrator actually spent time inside the house. Intimate knowledge often flows through secondary channels, like memorized schedules, architectural layouts, or tracking the victim's exact whereabouts. Understanding exactly when the target lacked protection changes everything. Knowing the blind spots and the precise window of opportunity completely rewrites the narrative of this crime. Assuming the intruder followed a script implies an accomplice paved the way, a terrifying prospect that shifts the entire paradigm. Suddenly, we are no longer hunting a lone wolf in the shadows, but unraveling a complex web of accomplices. Shared secrets and mapped out schedules ultimately point the finger right back at the victim's inner circle during her final hours. This brings us to a massive turning point, right where the soothing press conferences directly contradicted the actual police footwork. Even as spokespeople shielded the relatives from media scrutiny, detectives kept hovering around the couple's immediate sphere. Eyewitnesses spotted patrol cars canvassing the couple's block heavily on February 7th. Detectives returned on February 10th to grill the locals and pull security tapes, intensifying the neighborhood sweep. During that exact window, crime scene technicians impounded Nancy's car and confiscated all digital recording devices. Let us stop right there, because this is the exact moment armchair detectives sensed a massive cover-up brewing. Conducting standard procedures hardly guarantees anyone committed a felony. We must remember that knocking on doors is not an indictment, and executing a warrant falls incredibly short of a guilty verdict. Gathering forensic data frequently leads down dead ends, as detectives are simply following the breadcrumbs. Thorough cops must chase every lead, yet the optics of those actions sent shockwaves through the community. Citizens listened to officials exonerate the relatives while simultaneously watching the squad car parade outside their front doors. This glaring discrepancy proves the investigation remained fiercely active behind completely closed doors. Under such intense subterranean scrutiny, every single interpersonal relationship within the household becomes critical. Alibis take a back seat to body language, media strategies, and deciding exactly who acts as the designated spokesperson. We naturally have to wonder who suddenly stepped away from the microphone. One person aggressively commanded the spotlight while another vanished into thin air, the second suspicion mounted. Refusing to speak suddenly transformed Annie into a central character, though keeping quiet hardly equals a confession. Suspects clam up for countless reasons, including sheer panic, attorney orders, emotional burnout, or avoiding further controversy. Nevertheless, shutting down is an action, and striking deviations from the norm always raise massive red flags. Savannah stood her ground in the media glare, constantly begging the community to remember the tragedy. She essentially operated as the grieving heart of the entire clan on national television. Meanwhile, the other sister practically dissolved into the background completely. People definitely noticed that glaring disparity, prompting audiences to dissect every syllable the vocal sister uttered. She never actually pointed a finger at her sibling during any broadcast. Yet when one sibling monopolizes the tragedy while the other hides, the spotlight amplifies every single statement made. Audiences rip apart every sentence and analyze every tear, treating minor vocal inflections like major criminal evidence. This microscopic analysis intensifies when the actual police hunt violently changes direction. Keep in mind that their initial pressers focused entirely on a frantic, terrifying race against the clock to bring her home safely. Law enforcement was sifting through potential ransom communications, And the family's phrasing really mirrored that agonizing uncertainty, that terrible state where desperate optimism and sheer terror live side by side. Eventually, their tone started shifting, though it wasn't a sudden pivot or something easily summarized in a single phrase. It morphed slowly, much like how people talk when they begin processing a dark truth they cannot yet substantiate. Toward the end of February, Savannah started hinting publicly that Nancy could already be deceased, despite the family boosting the payout and continuing to plead for tips. By then, the bounty for answers had swelled beyond $200,000. Subsequent coverage revealed that the federal payout, combined with private donations and community backing, had expanded significantly. This subtle pivot is crucial because those phrases carry a totally different weight than an initial plea for a quick rescue. The vibe completely alters, originating from a fresh emotional state where sorrow is simply aligning with the grim facts. Other times, it represents sorrow responding to confidential details that the rest of the world has not yet seen. This hardly proves Savannah identified the culprit or harbored concrete suspicions about Annie, yet it confirms the entire mood shifted, taking her rhetoric along for the ride. Whenever this occurs during an investigation, already burdened by tight schedules, disguised suspects, last known contacts, and block-by-block searches, coupled with doubts regarding the trespasser's inside knowledge, folks naturally start asking a much tougher question. Was Savannah merely venting as a heartbroken child, or was she subtly tiptoeing around a devastating reality that pointed toward her inner circle? As the investigation progressed, the primary conflict shifted away from insiders versus outsiders, morphing into an incredibly chilling distinction. Who was genuinely blindsided by Nancy vanishing without a trace, and who possessed a far deeper understanding of the events than they ever confessed to the press? The second that theory takes root in the narrative, a single piece of evidence outweighs everything else, overshadowing the entryway, the security footage, and the discarded gloves, the automobile. Once detectives drill down on transit and schedules, a ride transforms from a simple machine into a crucial missing link. For this specific puzzle, that link might tether the final verified sighting to the subsequent tragedy. Here's exactly where the mystery expands from an isolated incident into a sprawling, complex web. After authorities assume Nancy was abducted from her residence, they expand their gaze past the front steps, the entryway, or the disguised figure on tape, preferring to map out whatever links her final ordinary moments to the dark void that followed. They hunt for transitional zones. They dig into chronological holes, searching desperately for whatever spans the gap between the last conversation and the vanishing act. Within this specific framework, one item perfectly fit the bill as the missing puzzle piece: the automobile. Police hauled Nancy's sedan away from the property while simultaneously seizing security hardware to comb through potential clues. That action by itself speaks volumes regarding their underlying strategy. They never viewed a solitary recording as the magic bullet, opting instead to broaden their scope to include transit data, cyber footprints, and whatever else might expose the events surrounding February 1st, though caution is necessary here. Media accounts fall short of confirming that Tommaso's private ride acted as the ultimate linchpin in this investigation. Nothing I have independently authenticated supports that specific claim. What the open files do indicate is that automobiles, lenses, electronic breadcrumbs, and suburban ring cameras essentially form the backbone of the detective work, which is vital for connecting the dots. It transcends mere appearances, focusing instead on arrival methods, escape routes, and rebuilding the exact logistical flow after the dust settles. A much more pragmatic view boils down to this: the transit chronology and the physical path are absolutely paramount. The logic behind this priority clicks into place the moment you adopt a detective's mindset. Nancy's final acknowledged interaction was sharing a meal and catching a ride with Annie and Tommaso, sparking a rapidly shrinking timeline. Officials eventually stated their conviction that she was intentionally singled out. Furthermore, Sheriff Chris Ninos mentioned his team figured out the underlying reason although he is keeping it under wraps for now. This proves they never viewed the crime as a stroke of bad luck. They handled it as a meticulously calculated strike. The minute you realize it was premeditated, the logistical schedule takes center stage, tracing exactly who drove where and when. Investigators focused heavily on visual evidence, digital footprints, and any physical clues that link back to local surveillance footage. Consequently, the vehicle's exact route throughout this ordeal takes on a chilling role, essentially acting as an unspoken observer to the crime. We definitely do not have all the concrete answers regarding its significance just yet. However, detectives strongly suspected the solution rested within the peripheral activities rather than just the incident, casting an even darker shadow over the primary subjects involved. To be perfectly clear, no official evidence currently points directly to their involvement. Sheriff Nanos even went on record to officially eliminate the relatives from their list of potential perpetrators. Keeping that official declaration in mind is absolutely crucial for maintaining the integrity of our narrative. Yet another undeniable fact remains, as authorities continuously scoured the immediate area of interest and tirelessly gathered new materials. Detectives relentlessly processed the data, approaching the entire situation like an active mystery waiting to be solved. Naturally, this underlying friction sparked a deep sense of discomfort for those following the drama from home. Whenever authorities try to calm the masses while simultaneously ramping up their search efforts, eyebrows inevitably raise. The public quickly shifted their focus away from formal charges and started scrutinizing personal conduct, making the younger sister's sudden withdrawal highly suspicious. While staying quiet absolutely does not prove someone committed a crime, the stark behavioral differences certainly raise compelling questions. Savannah remained constantly in the spotlight, desperately pleading for community support and sharing contact information for federal authorities. She poured her entire heart into the desperate search for her mother, maintaining her resolve despite openly admitting the terrifying chance of a tragic outcome. She consistently begged witnesses to speak up, reminding everyone that they could claim the massive bounty while keeping their identities completely hidden. Taking such an aggressive and highly visible stance requires an incredible amount of relentless determination. However, as one sister tirelessly commanded the microphone, the other sibling's complete absence from the media circus became glaringly obvious. Spotting this massive discrepancy inevitably caused the audience to start wondering about the underlying dynamics at play. What caused one sibling to aggressively champion the investigation while her counterpart completely vanished into the shadows, a mystery that could easily stem from basic human differences. Everything from varied grief reactions and strict attorney instructions to a simple inability to handle the intense spotlight could easily explain the behavior. While all those explanations make perfect sense, internet sleuths are notoriously obsessed with behavioral trends rather than just sticking to the cold, hard evidence. Spotting these distinct family dynamics naturally forces the audience to heavily overanalyze every single syllable spoken by the more vocal sibling. This dynamic perfectly sets the stage for deeply analyzing Savannah's specific choice of words, which is arguably the most fascinating psychological aspect of this tragedy. During those crucial early days, her media appearances heavily relied on begging the community for immediate assistance. The desperate pleas revolved around asking neighbors to step up, share any clues they had, and ultimately help resolve the horrific nightmare. The relatives quickly bumped the financial incentive past $200,000, eventually pushing the staggering total to a massive $1 million. They tirelessly campaigned for any clues leading to a rescue or an apprehension, though observers quickly noticed a subtle shift in the overall atmosphere of their pleas. A tiny glimmer of optimism certainly lingered, yet a distinct sense of grim reality began weaving its way into her speeches. Rather than negotiating for a hostage release, her words sounded eerily like someone mentally bracing for an absolutely heartbreaking outcome. Viewers definitely noticed when Savannah boosted the massive cash prize on February 24th, openly confessing that her mother might have passed away while simultaneously begging for new leads. Such a drastic evolution in her perspective completely flipped the narrative, adding unprecedented gravity to an incredibly active missing persons investigation. The audience immediately started wondering whether her shifting attitude stemmed from the passage of time, overwhelming sorrow, or perhaps secret details shared by local detectives. Perhaps the crushing burden of mounting evidence, including the disguised intruder, the last known communications, and the relentless forensic sweeps simply became too much to bear. The intense local scrutiny and baffling vehicular routes likely pushed her to accept a grim reality long before the general public caught up. The documentary's branding suddenly feels far more disturbing than just simple clickbait, especially considering Savannah never directly accused her sibling of the crime. She totally avoided pointing fingers, proving that deep-seated distrust often surfaces without anyone uttering a single formal accusation. It frequently bleeds into the atmosphere through subtle vocal shifts, transforming casual remarks into incredibly guarded, grief-stricken, and highly complex statements. The telltale sign usually appears when a highly vocal individual clearly seems burdened by devastating secrets, and if that dynamic was actually at play, the implications are chilling. The ultimate nightmare wouldn't just be some random phantom attacker striking from the shadows, but rather the terrifying possibility that the real culprit belonged to the victim's innermost circle. This naturally brings up an incredibly sensitive issue as the audience begins closely analyzing the deeper meaning behind the grieving daughter's increasingly sorrowful remarks. People became obsessed with tracking the younger sister's lingering influence over the unfolding drama, despite her complete disappearance from the media spotlight. Exploring that specific family dynamic introduces a whole new level of mental complexity to an already baffling mystery. When investigating these types of tragedies, the focus extends far beyond the actual victim or the blurry figures captured on neighborhood surveillance footage. The spotlight inevitably falls on the individuals who seized the microphone to speak out, perfectly explaining why the older sibling immediately established herself as the face of the tragic ordeal. Once authorities officially classified Nancy's vanishing as a criminal investigation on February 2nd, things shifted. Savannah issued a heartfelt plea, desperately seeking her mom's safe homecoming, which sounded exactly like any family plunged into sudden terror. They expressed deep thanks and sheer desperation with one clear mission: getting her back safely, though Savannah's actions soon took an interesting turn as the heat cranked up. Rather than using singular pronouns, she continuously relied on plural terms to represent a united front. Her words were framed as the voice of the entire inner circle, representing the kids and everyone deeply connected to the missing woman. They desperately maintained a unified facade for the cameras, even as the situation behind closed doors steadily deteriorated. During their recorded appeal on February 7th, she gripped the hands of Cameron and Annie while dropping that haunting, unforgettable quote, "Your demands have been heard, and we get it. The ransom money is yours." Rumors swirled that federal agents coached them prior to a previous broadcast, though officials stressed that the final script was entirely crafted by the relatives themselves. Using a collective voice carries massive weight, since stepping up as a designated spokesperson often forces an individual to shoulder much more than just broadcasting appeals. That designated speaker suddenly absorbs the entire group's crushing anxiety, defensive tactics, and occasionally their darkest secrets. Consequently, Annie's shadow begins looming large over the narrative, despite her own lips remaining tightly sealed. We cannot overlook this incredibly nuanced yet crucial detail regarding the older sister's actual physical participation during those initial press conferences. She definitely showed up on camera alongside Cameron and Savannah, presenting a solid wall of sibling solidarity. Yet as days bled into weeks, Savannah evolved into the primary emotional compass for the ordeal, though this shift does not automatically signal bad blood. This divergence in behavior is not a smoking gun for foul play or outright mistrust, but it undoubtedly brews a highly uncomfortable atmosphere. Annie still anchors the critical timeline, acting as the last known link to Nancy while facing intense police heat focused directly on her own property. Despite all that, the heart-wrenching narrative fed to the public continues to pour almost exclusively from Savannah's mouth. Spectators quickly caught on to this vibe, analyzing beyond just the factual updates provided about the missing mother. Audiences noticed how Annie constantly drifted back into the spotlight via her sister's media appearances, whether through sheer physical closeness or unspoken implication. It became incredibly obvious when they shared the screen, as the outgoing sister bared her soul while the other maintained a totally unreadable stoic demeanor. The glaring behavioral gap grew impossible to dismiss the second detectives executed a raid on the residence belonging to Tommaso and his wife. The local sheriff eventually went on record stating that every single child and their romantic partners were entirely, officially exonerated. However, he made that declaration only after cops secured legal permission to toss the couple's house, leaving two highly contradictory facts permanently etched into history. Such friction is precisely what makes this chapter so deeply disturbing, forcing outsiders to juggle a pair of clashing realities. On one hand, you have a grieving set of relatives who received a clean bill of health from the local authorities. On the flip side, agents still felt compelled to tear through the property of the exact two people who saw the victim last. Balancing these conflicting truths naturally leads analytical minds to question if the vocal sister was also drowning in that very same cognitive dissonance. Put yourself in her shoes for a second. Your mom vanishes into thin air, and suddenly a disguised figure enters the chat. Extortion notes drop, local police walk on eggshells, federal agents swarm the scene, and your entire household is shoved in front of news lenses. Simultaneously, the very home where your sibling and her husband sleep transforms into an active, highly visible crime scene search. No matter how hard you try gluing the family's image together for the cameras, it takes a massive toll. It would absolutely shatter your normal vocabulary, twisting your sentence structures and permanently poisoning the way you express optimism. Hence, our documentary continuously circles back to dissecting those specific press conference transcripts. We are not claiming she secretly accused her sister, but rather recognizing that human speech cracks under pressure way before any solid truths emerge. Approaching the end of February, her vocal delivery took a drastically darker pivot. While bumping the bounty to $1 million, she openly admitted her mother could be dead. Concurrently, she insisted they were clinging to a sliver of faith, begging for tips that might bring her back safely. Gone was the sheer blissful ignorance, replaced by a tortured soul trapped between blind optimism, quiet terror, public relations campaigns, and intense police scrutiny. This profound psychological fracture truly acts as the beating heart of the whole tragic saga. Grasping that mental divide makes the core premise of our investigation completely logical. We may lack a neat resolution or hard proof, but harboring doubts rarely resembles a dramatic courtroom accusation anyway. It often manifests as cautiously choosing your vocabulary while the entire world crumbles beneath your feet. You might bravely hold back tears on television, even as your underlying message gradually surrenders to a much grimmer reality. It is the sheer stubbornness of clinging to plural pronouns long after your so-called partners have stopped pulling their weight in the media circus. Assuming this dynamic was actually in play, the audience naturally picked up on the toxic undercurrents without needing a formal denunciation of her sibling. Her only job was to hold the floor and speak her mind, but as she kept talking, audiences started picking up on a fascinating dual narrative. There was the official version meant for public consumption, and then the hidden truth her shifting vocabulary seemed to quietly reveal. This perfectly tees up the next massive twist in our investigation, since up to this moment, the tension stemmed entirely from the timeline, the intense searches, the jarring family dynamics, and the shifting emotions in Savannah's interviews. Yet, an entirely different kind of stress was about to shake up the narrative. Enter a professional profiler, offering an objective perspective by examining the evidence and boldly asking the exact question the public was too afraid to vocalize. The moment that expert weighed in, the whole investigation pivoted dramatically. Right here is exactly where raw emotional distress violently crashes into a brand new reality. We are talking about genuine external analysis rather than cheap rumors, mindless internet speculation, or wild anonymous conspiracies spreading online. It was a truly professional assessment, because when an investigation hits this critical milestone, following the terrifying masked intruder video and the exhaustive hunts, things inevitably escalate. Past all the desperate family appeals, the evolving vocabulary, and the glaring disconnect between obvious police scrutiny and the comforting official statements, a breaking point is reached. The public desperately wants an independent authority figure to finally connect the dots and explain what these bizarre clues actually indicate. Once that professional opinion drops, the narrative fundamentally shifts yet again. Before this moment, every single lead we chased originated from the exact same foundational evidence, like the established chronology and the security cameras. We relied heavily on police movements and the outward actions of the individuals in Nancy's immediate inner circle. While those elements alone do not automatically prove a domestic conspiracy, their combined weight forms a specific pattern that criminal psychologists study to find hidden vulnerabilities rather than just miraculously solving the crime. This specific phase is absolutely crucial, primarily because the involvement of a psychological profiler changes everything. Throwing suspicion onto a victim's relatives is never a random occurrence in these types of dark mysteries. That doubt creeps in the second an investigation stops resembling a random stranger abduction and begins to morph into something much more complex. It begins to look like a targeted operation driven by intimate access, insider knowledge, perfect timing, and glaring behavioral inconsistencies. This shift occurs the exact moment ordinary citizens start picking up on the reality that detectives have understood all along. The ultimate revelation in certain kidnapping plots is not the identity of the person caught on camera, but rather the mastermind who orchestrated the perfect environment for that crime to happen. Therefore, we need to hit pause and confront the massive question this whole series has been building towards, especially considering the escalating stress in Savannah's public statements. We must consider how Annie's sudden disappearance from the spotlight felt incredibly suspicious, while Tommaso was firmly cemented as the last person to see Nancy alive. Add in the fact that detectives relentlessly zeroed in on that inner circle, even as officials practically begged the media to stop blaming the family. So what dark reality was actually brewing beneath all that carefully managed PR, bringing our two distinct investigative trails crashing into the exact same point? Our first major focus is the sister storyline, which is absolutely not a wild accusation that Annie was the disguised attacker. It is also definitely not some irresponsible theory claiming that choosing to stay quiet automatically makes someone a murderer. Instead, it highlights how Annie's unique placement naturally made her a magnet for suspicion simply because she was part of Nancy's final safety net and showed her face during those initial desperate pleas for help. She then abruptly faded into the background the second the media started digging into her personal household. That disappearing act alone is guaranteed to give anyone the creeps, particularly for armchair detectives obsessively analyzing every subtle shift in Savannah's voice. Our second critical path revolves around Tommaso, and while we are not officially labeling him a suspect, the forensic reality of his final interactions is impossible to ignore. The logistics of that final drop-off and the exact chronology of his movements are absolute game changers. The million-dollar question for detectives is whether this masked intruder was just a random opportunist striking in the dark or a coordinated operative who benefited heavily from inside intel. Whenever you start constructing a theory around an inside job, all roads inevitably lead straight back to the people who were closest to Nancy during her final moments of freedom. That right there is the explosive intersection. Because if Savannah's overwhelming anxiety was secretly connected to Annie, it changes the entire dynamic. Her intense dread probably did not stem from a literal belief that her own sister physically committed the horrible crime. The actual terror might have been far more deeply chilling, rooted in a gut feeling that Annie possessed dangerous secrets or was standing way too close to the literal smoking gun. Or perhaps it was the horrifying realization that the entire Annie and Tommaso dynamic fell way too close to that final window of opportunity to be purely coincidental. At this exact juncture, the distinct storylines of both the sister and the boyfriend bleed together into one terrifying, overarching theory of an inside job. The moment you truly grasp that critical intersection, the core premise of this entire investigative series snaps into crystal clear focus. This manhunt did not suddenly shift its crosshairs onto the family just because of a single shocking piece of evidence. The heat turned strictly inward because a mountain of bizarre clues simultaneously pointed toward the exact same conclusion starting with the fact that Nancy's final sighting happened right after dining with Annie and Tommaso. The disguised perpetrator on the camera clearly operated with chilling precision and intent. Meanwhile, law enforcement relentlessly gathered clues that tightly orbited her immediate circle, while Savannah's public messaging drastically morphed from frantic rescue pleas into a much darker mix of preemptive mourning and cautious hope. Ultimately, the authorities were forced to juggle giving out public exonerations for the family while running an aggressive background investigation that kept those exact relatives trapped right at the center of the crosshairs. However, we must remain objective, since suspicious coincidences don't automatically equate to legally binding verdicts. Law enforcement officials, specifically Sheriff Chris Nanos, officially cleared the relatives while continually cautioning the public to avoid spreading baseless rumors. Simultaneously, detectives are operating under the strong assumption that someone specifically went out of their way to go after Nancy. Authorities might actually grasp the underlying reasons behind the act, yet they continue hunting for clues in this wide-open investigation. Therefore, all these facts coexist simultaneously, forcing us to balance a pair of conflicting narratives at the exact same time. Initially, we must acknowledge how fast internet sleuths and community gossip can devolve into vicious, unjustified attacks on innocent people. Choosing not to speak out isn't an admission of guilt, and trauma affects everyone in unique ways, often causing distressed relatives to sound strange. People isolate themselves or act bizarrely during catastrophic events for a multitude of psychological reasons, totally unrelated to hiding illicit secrets. Furthermore, routine police procedures like property sweeps and neighborhood check-ins might simply be stepping stones pointing toward entirely different suspects. On the flip side, we cannot ignore the sheer volume of deeply unsettling mysteries lingering around this specific tragedy. There are glaring inconsistencies regarding the relatives that the official police statements haven't entirely managed to sweep under the rug. Those last documented interactions with her loved ones carry immense weight, just as the exact moment that disguised intruder arrived remains incredibly significant. Tracking exactly who went where is absolutely crucial, along with the very noticeable shifts in how Savannah chose to tell her side of the story. Annie taking a massive step back from the spotlight definitely raises eyebrows from a behavioral standpoint, even without serving as hard evidence. Meanwhile, the stark contrast between cops telling everyone to relax while actively tearing apart the town creates an undeniably ominous cloud over the whole ordeal, which perfectly segues into our toughest pill to swallow, considering how straightforward this horrific nightmare originally appeared when we started filming. Exactly who was hiding behind that disguise on Nancy Guthrie's front porch? Yet after diving deep into the rabbit hole, that singular query sits alongside a much bleaker, deeply personal, and highly unnerving train of thought. Did Savannah eventually become terrified not just of some random prowler, but of the sickening possibility that the culprit was hiding right there within her own inner circle? Ultimately, that is the exact crossroads where we find ourselves this evening, with Nancy Guthrie still completely unaccounted for. Law enforcement insists the hunt is ongoing and highly specific, though they lack concrete proof identifying the creep caught creeping on the doorbell cam. Zero verifiable facts show whether her relatives possessed any hidden knowledge, yet the mainstream timeline leaves behind a massive trail of glaring blind spots. We simply cannot ignore the timeline discrepancies, the property sweeps, the eerie quietness, and the constantly shifting testimonies. Furthermore, there is a very real chance that the guy caught on video was merely a pawn playing his part in a much larger, well-organized scheme. Perhaps the ultimate mystery extends far beyond figuring out if that disguised intruder pulled this off entirely by himself. Honestly, the most gut-wrenching aspect of this entire tragedy might suggest that the disguise wasn't even the scariest piece of the puzzle. Rather, the truly chilling factor is the distinct likelihood that someone incredibly close to the victim possessed far more damning information than they ever let on. Let us pick up the trail from there, absolutely refusing to act like the dust has settled, and instead diving headfirst into the lingering unknowns. What makes Nancy Guthrie vanishing into thin air so incredibly horrifying is that Authorities can no longer brush this off as a simple mix-up. This wasn't a freak accident or a glitchy camera feed, and as of March 13, 2026, Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed they view this as a highly calculated hit. Cops are convinced they know exactly why this happened, and they are relentlessly grinding away at the investigation every single day. However, they haven't officially pointed fingers at anyone yet, though they are actively testing multiple DNA samples while warning that this predator might genuinely strike a second time. Hearing that completely shifts the entire vibe of this situation, radically raising the stakes on everything we've unpacked so far. The police department certainly isn't viewing this whole nightmare as a harmless misunderstanding. They definitely don't think it was a random act of violence, nor are they acting like they've got it all wrapped up behind closed doors, despite having a solid working theory. The top brass made it crystal clear that the victim was zeroed in on for a very specific, carefully calculated reason. Furthermore, detectives are aggressively hunting down potential accomplices and digital footprints, particularly focusing on those weird Wi-Fi outages that hit the block that fateful evening. Now take a step back and consider how massively this impacts the relatives, because a premeditated attack automatically puts the people closest to her right under the microscope. This doesn't inherently mean the bloodline pulled the trigger, but it absolutely implies they held the keys to her daily habits and deepest secrets. They possessed unrestricted access to her property and were the absolute last ones to interact with her before everything went completely off the rails, which perfectly explains why this mystery refuses to fit neatly into the basic narrative of a disguised prowler snatching an older lady out of nowhere. Conversely, the brutal reality dictates that pulling off such a targeted strike required incredibly intimate insider knowledge of her everyday existence. That profoundly disturbing realization casts a massive, incredibly dark cloud over every single piece of evidence we've looked at so far. In this context, Tommaso giving her that final ride matters immensely, just as Annie's presence in those final hours carries massive weight while cops rip through their private devices. Detectives are actively digging through their digital lives, tearing apart their cars, and thoroughly searching their personal residences to find absolutely any hidden clues. Despite authorities eventually clearing the relatives, everything still needs to be viewed through that specific lens. Just think about how unsettling the whole picture becomes once you connect those dots. Law enforcement officially removed the relatives from their suspect list, publicly labeling them as innocent sufferers in this ordeal. Yet, the head investigator openly admitted that detectives seized the family's personal electronics, including laptops and cell phones, and completely tore through their cars and residences, making sure to exhaust every single theory before granting them a clean bill of health. Holding those two realities simultaneously makes perfect sense in police work. Thorough detectives absolutely have to tear through a subject's life in high-stakes investigations like this one, but that dual approach leaves armchair detectives grappling with some serious mental whiplash. Relatives might be completely off the hook in the eyes of the law, but they remain hopelessly tangled in the most critical hours leading up to the crime. That bizarre contradiction probably explains why the audience reacts so intensely to every single move Savannah makes. She stepped up as the primary spokesperson, right from the jump, delivering the initial press releases and pushing through those desperate calls for help and bounty updates. The daughter eventually made her way back to the victim's residence on March 2nd, bringing Annie and Tommaso along for support, and laid down fresh bouquets at the expanding memorial site, begging the community to keep the faith alive. Seeing them present a united front carries massive weight, especially while so many dark mysteries swirl around them. Presenting a solid face to the cameras rarely fixes the deep fractures hidden behind closed doors, though audiences can practically sense that underlying tension radiating through their screens, even without a shred of hard evidence to back it up. The daughter's public statements have shifted dramatically, navigating a very clear spectrum of grief. She started with frantic pleas for a safe homecoming, pivoted to talking about hostage demands, and finally landed in this agonizing space between holding on and letting go. As February bled into early March, the privately funded bounty skyrocketed, while federal agents tossed $100,000 into the pot, pushing the grand total toward a staggering $1 million for a successful rescue or conviction. Watching a grieving child completely alter her messaging during a live kidnapping investigation naturally makes the public hang on to her every syllable. Observers aren't necessarily treating every teardrop or cracked voice as a hidden puzzle piece. They are paying close attention because sorrow can morph naturally as the clock ticks down, or it can twist suddenly when new secrets come to light. Nobody outside the inner circle truly knows what sparked her tonal shift, but detectives swear they are gaining ground and narrowing the gap, adding that the scope of the investigation keeps expanding, and authorities remain absolutely convinced that whoever grabbed Nancy did so with terrifying precision and purpose. That exact creeping suspicion is likely what keeps dragging true crime junkies right back down the rabbit hole. No single piece of evidence suddenly cracked the mystery wide open, because it absolutely did not. Authorities definitely haven't fed the masses enough puzzle pieces to solve the riddle themselves either. They truly have kept us in the dark, leading everyone to wonder why this mess feels so intimately tied to the relatives, despite the official police narrative. What makes that final crucial time frame of opportunity seem like the most pivotal piece of the entire board? How come that chilling snapshot of the disguised intruder falls completely flat unless you know exactly what was happening right before he showed up? Why do the daughter's relentless media appearances hit deeper than a standard cry for help, feeling almost like she is desperately fighting a cover-up? The biggest lingering mystery is why, even after the relatives were entirely cleared by the cops, do so many of the darkest questions inevitably circle back to wondering who had direct access to Nancy right before the blackout. We can clearly see the boogeyman, but the network of insider information that brought him there is completely invisible. Tracking who knew what is almost always how you catch the real monster. Nancy remains vanished without a trace, and the police department refuses to drop a single name regarding potential suspects. Top brass insists they have nailed down a solid motive, yet they are starving the public of the critical details needed to actually understand their working theory. Contaminated genetic profiles are still floating around as a promising breadcrumb, while the bloodline keeps standing shoulder to shoulder for the cameras. A massive shadow looms over this entire tragedy, leaving us absolutely paralyzed by one chilling thought. It takes way more than a random thug on a porch to pull off a hit, meaning someone had to feed him the blueprint. That grim realization feels like the only appropriate place to pause this chapter of the nightmare. We are not pointing fingers or claiming to hold the gospel truth, but we cannot ignore the sinister undercurrent brewing since day one. A faceless prowler might actually be the least terrifying element of Nancy Guthrie's vanishing act. The ultimate truth probably lies buried under a tangled web of security codes, privileged entryways, along with perfect scheduling and inside secrets clearly bubbling right below the water's edge. That brutal realization is honestly the most sickening twist in this entire saga. The horror is not merely the fact that a woman evaporated into thin air, but that onlookers are permanently trapped, bouncing back and forth between two half-finished puzzles. If you look at the first canvas, it paints the picture of a classic random home invasion gone wrong. You have a disguised prowler, a vulnerable senior citizen, a night of absolute terror, and a frantic manhunt for an unknown predator. Officials insist she was dragged out kicking and screaming during the darkest hours of February 1st, backing it up with federal security snaps of a covered face lurking on the porch. Flip the lens, however, and the psychological weight of this mystery becomes incredibly suffocating, especially since detectives are now openly calling this a meticulously planned hit, swearing they know exactly why it happened, while actively hunting down potential accomplices who might have fed the boogeyman on tape his intel. Sheriff Chris Nanos went on record about analyzing compromised genetic evidence lifted from the crime scene, issuing a chilling warning that this monster might actually come out of the woodwork to claim another victim. Looking at both photos together completely flips the narrative, because a premeditated hit brings up way more than just asking who pulled the trigger. You have to wonder about the level of planning involved, and it makes you ask exactly what kind of intelligence was gathered before the sun went down. It forces us to consider if the figure caught on tape was working alone, or simply the only one foolish enough to step into the frame. This is exactly why every single minute of the relatives' whereabouts remains absolutely crucial. Sheriff Nano stated that family members underwent intense scrutiny before being cleared, which meant digging through their cell phones, laptops, houses, and cars. However, this also proves the inner circle was viewed with enough suspicion to warrant such deep digging before the cops felt comfortable officially backing off. Just try to picture the psychological toll that takes on a household behind closed doors. Forget the news broadcasts and the front pages. Think about the reality at home where a mom is gone, the whole country is watching, and extortion letters are rolling in. Federal agents take over, and detectives start grilling the victim's absolute closest loved ones simply because standard procedure dictates it. Meanwhile, everyone is forced to put on a brave face and act united for the cameras. Savannah, Annie, and Cameron pulled off exactly that front in early February, stepping up to the microphones after law enforcement revealed a note had been delivered. Savannah directly addressed the individuals pulling the strings. She claimed they got the demands and were completely willing to hand over the cash, making it an incredibly gut-wrenching watch. The footage captured relatives desperate to look solid while the situation was raw, chaotic, and terrifyingly vague, which gives the whole saga a heavy psychological burden. After all, smiling through the pain on camera completely masked the absolute hell they were living through off-screen. Months passed, and even after police officially cleared the inner circle, Savannah and Annie did not just walk away from the spotlight. Tommaso joined them back at Nancy's house on March 2nd to lay down memorial wreaths and beg the community to keep praying, painting a picture of total devotion. Or you could interpret it as incredibly delicate, showing a fractured household desperately clinging together amidst an unsolved, premeditated mystery. This exact clash of feelings forms the absolute core of the entire film. On the surface, everyone held hands while detectives stared at a deliberate, unsolved hit. From a psychological standpoint, the rhetoric grew darker as Savannah refused to stay quiet, constantly pushing people to call the federal tip line. She constantly kept the spotlight on the tragedy and aggressively promoted the bounty increases month after month. When a person refuses to shut down during an unimaginable living hell, it changes how we listen. Observers start picking apart the shifting tone, noticing how early desperate pleas for a safe return slowly morphed into cold bargaining. Eventually, the words took a much darker turn, blending desperate wishes with grim reality and frantic action with a creeping sense of doom. News outlets confirmed by late February that the relatives had massively bumped up the cash prize for any solid clues. Savannah actually went on the record admitting Nancy might be dead even while begging for her return, though this dark realization does not necessarily point to a cover-up. However, it absolutely confirms that the loved ones trapped in this nightmare had completely changed how they were processing the trauma. This is exactly why audiences cannot stop dwelling on such a deeply disturbing theory. It is not about siblings pointing fingers, but rather the immense pressure altering how Savannah presented the narrative to the world. Paranoia can scream at the top of its lungs, but sometimes it operates in total silence. It can manifest as a deliberate hesitation or continuing to use the word we while completely doubting who is actually on your team. It often resembles a loyal child shielding her kin from the press, all while secretly understanding the real truth lies far away from the spotlight. Naturally, this cycles us right back to Tommaso's involvement. He was never officially labeled a person of interest or definitively connected to the crime. Yet, he remains the final documented stepping stone connecting Nancy's ordinary night to the absolute nightmare that swallowed her. Reports indicate Nancy shared a meal with Annie and Tommaso before he chauffeured her back to her place on January 31st. That final car ride locks him permanently into the chronological puzzle, ensuring his name will forever haunt the investigation. Detectives might have cleared the relatives, but clearing a name does not magically erase the established sequence of events. Those crucial minutes stay locked in stone, carrying immense significance. Furthermore, if authorities are looking into hired help, local internet blackouts, genetic profiling, and a deeply personal grudge, it changes everything. Then that final opportunity for contact remains incredibly vital, if only to help us grasp exactly what the attacker was aware of. Where exactly does all of this twisted evidence leave the audience. We are stuck in the worst possible limbo a mystery fanatic can endure, staring down an intense, progressing manhunt that remains frustratingly unsolved. The cops claim they figured out the motive behind Nancy's abduction, but they still refuse to drop the name of the true mastermind. Authorities might have cleared her relatives, but those closest to her remain at the heart of this tragedy since the last known timeline leads straight back to them. Law enforcement insists this was a calculated attack, suddenly making the mystery of inside information far more critical than simply figuring out the culprit's identity. Perhaps that exact chilling detail is what continues drawing the public so deeply into this unfolding nightmare. It certainly isn't due to any solid evidence pointing at her loved ones, but rather because the investigation continuously drags one horrifying possibility back to the surface. Could it be that the true puzzle was never truly about discovering the masked intruder, but rather uncovering the insider details that allowed him to strike at the perfect moment? Lingering suspicions like that are exactly why Nancy Guthrie's vanishing continues to feel like an open, bleeding wound rather than a finished chapter. A disguised face certainly provides a terrifying visual. However, the sequence of events delivers the deepest cut, and her inner circle, despite being publicly exonerated, fiercely defended, and fiercely united, will forever represent the exact spot where Nancy's normal life stopped and the dark unknown took over. Therefore, before diving any deeper, keep that tension in mind, not as an accusation, but as a crucial dynamic, since the upcoming chapter isn't about wrapping everything up neatly in one single bound. Instead, we need to carefully navigate that murky territory between the facts detectives currently possess and the secrets they are still withholding from the rest of us. Interestingly enough, that specific stretch of silence could easily be the most telling aspect of this entire investigation. Whenever detectives openly announce to the press that they have figured out the motive behind a crime, yet absolutely refuse to name a suspect or explain how the intricate plot actually unfolded, it almost always implies they are fiercely guarding a working theory that is far too fragile for the spotlight right now. Back on March 13th, 2026, Sheriff Chris Nanos declared that law enforcement felt absolutely certain Nancy Guthrie was specifically singled out. He also mentioned they had pinned down the reason why and were steadily chasing fresh leads while keeping any potential suspects completely unnamed, which reveals something massive. This investigation isn't drowning in utter confusion anymore, but rather hovering in a very deliberate state of partial clarity. Unfortunately, that gray area of half-truths is exactly where loved ones experience the most agony, because the moment authorities start keeping secrets, everyone tied to the victim gets trapped inside a suffocating, invisible pressure cooker. On camera, they continuously beg the community for helpful tips. Out in the open, they tread lightly, ensuring they never accidentally slip up and say a single word that might jeopardize the police work. Behind closed doors, however, they are forced to obsessively analyze every subtle shift in tone, suspicious timing, or glaring omission from the cops. They also notice those terrifying micro changes when detectives suddenly abandon general inquiries and pivot toward laser-focused interrogations, which perfectly explains why Savannah's time in the spotlight carries such an unbearable weight. Throughout this ordeal, the daughter hasn't just been shouting into an empty canyon, but desperately trying to communicate, while the foundational facts of the mystery constantly shifted right beneath her feet. During those initial frantic days, her relatives focused all their energy strictly on a rapid, desperate rescue mission. Shortly after that, bizarre ransom-like messages started rolling in, immediately followed by massively boosted cash rewards. Eventually, the heart-wrenching moment arrived where she had to admit on national television that her mother could truly be gone, fiercely clinging to whatever tiny shred of hope she had left. Anyone can clearly track this devastating downward spiral through old news clips showcasing an investigation that was morphing into something much darker right before our eyes. Let's take a quick breather right here, because this is the exact turning point where the narrative shifts away from cold facts and dives headfirst into raw psychological trauma. In the very beginning, a traumatized household operates purely on the frantic drive to bring their missing relative back unharmed. Once that fails, they shift gears toward desperately pleading with the kidnapper, but when the trail inevitably runs cold, a much more sinister reality begins to settle in. Suddenly, their daily life becomes a battle to endure the grim theories that detectives probably already believe, yet refuse to state on the evening news. That brutal, uncertain limbo perfectly describes the psychological hellscape Savannah appears to be navigating right now, completely devoid of solid proof or direct allegations. We are merely witnessing a devastated child speaking out from the center of a nightmare that shed its random abduction narrative a very long time ago. Simply put, the second the authorities start tossing around words like premeditated, establish a clear motive, and aggressively hunt down genetic evidence, while also chasing down potential co-conspirators and investigating mysterious neighborhood internet outages, the whole situation instantly transforms into an incredibly calculated and deeply personal attack. Naturally, that chilling realization is exactly why the victim's innermost circle can never entirely escape the investigative spotlight. Even after the police chief stood at a podium and explicitly cleared her relatives of any direct involvement, official documents confirm that detectives still relentlessly tore through their houses, scoured their cars, dumped their phones, and audited their laptops before finally backing off. Looking at this strictly through the lens of a developing true crime story, that fascinating dynamic leaves her loved ones officially removed from the suspect list, yet permanently shackled to the most critical sequence of events in the entire investigation. Such a bizarre paradox is absolutely mind-bending, so just try to imagine the psychological toll of being declared innocent while knowing her final waking hours revolve entirely around your actions. Detectives might not be treating you like a killer anymore, but the crucial window of opportunity still directly intertwines with your evening meals. It bleeds into your carpool routines, your casual chats, your daily commutes, your smart devices, and your personal sanctuary, which might not scream guilt, but certainly breeds an insane amount of pressure. Unbearable stress like that is precisely what audiences have been picking up on every single time Savannah speaks, whether they consciously recognize the nuance or not. That heavy realization is exactly where Annie's involvement takes on a uniquely terrifying vibe, and it has absolutely nothing to do with any concrete evidence suggesting she possessed guilty knowledge. Absolutely none. Yet given that Annie holds a spot that viewers simply cannot overlook, she hardly counts as some estranged family member. She definitely is not a random background character who showed up after the fact. She remains a core member of that ultimate inner circle, a key voice in the initial cries for help, and a crucial piece of the united front standing tearfully before the lenses. Not to mention, she belongs to the very household that attracted intense police scrutiny long before officials officially urged the public to stop pointing fingers at the family. That exact dynamic explains why the central mystery remains so incredibly alive today. What could possibly make Savannah look at certain points like her dread was suddenly aimed at her own circle? It is not that she ever stated it outright, but rather how the very framework of this investigation constantly drags that horrific thought back into the light. That disguised figure certainly suggests an outside attacker. However, the relative's own timeline clearly establishes an open door. Meanwhile, the sheriff, pointing out a specific motive, hands you the deliberate intent. The deafening quiet from detectives hints at massive chunks of missing background information, and combining that with Savannah's shifting choice of words gives you raw proof that Nancy's inner circle might have been grappling with a far darker reality than the rest of us ever realized. This same underlying tension makes Tommaso's role in the narrative completely impossible to shake. Let me be clear, he was never officially labeled as a suspect, but he represents that final stretch of utter normalcy right before everything spiraled into an absolute horror story. Media outlets have repeatedly confirmed that Nancy sharing a meal with Annie and Tommaso, followed by him giving her a ride back, marked the very edge of her timeline before she vanished into thin air. For an investigation that authorities now openly classify as a calculated hit, those final moments hold immense weight, even if they do not automatically prove guilt on their own. Moreover, if the attacker struck at the perfect moment, if their strategy was utterly intentional, and assuming detectives are still digging into sabotage electronics, genetic evidence, and the potential involvement of multiple co-conspirators, then onlookers are naturally going to wonder if the guy caught on camera was just the final operative in a massive web of inside knowledge. Honestly, that is the most terrifying scenario imaginable here. It goes beyond some random stranger breaking into Nancy's house, implying instead that the killer showed up armed with precise intelligence, allowing them to take advantage of the perfect time frame, the perfect target, the perfect evening, and the ultimate weak spot. Consequently, our film cannot stop returning to the power of what was said, what was hidden, and how the clock ticked down. Whenever the official story handed to the press contains glaring holes, those gaps are exactly where the simmering tension starts making noise. In those shadows, the shifting body language of loved ones practically screams about the agonizing secrets being kept safely tucked away from the cameras. Therefore, I want you to consider a critical question as we dive deeper. Suppose the police actually understand the exact reason for Nancy's abduction, yet they refuse to reveal the complete foundation of that theory to the world just yet. Which individuals connected to this tragedy are currently being crushed under the immense burden of knowing the ugly truth? At this point, the unfolding narrative extends way beyond a simple police procedural. It dives deeply into the psychological toll on relatives when the answers are hovering right around the corner, yet absolutely refuse to step out of the darkness. Frankly, that agonizing gray area might hold the biggest clues to this whole mess. Whenever law enforcement openly admits they have figured out the motive, yet adamantly refuse to name the culprit or break down the precise sequence of events, that kind of behavior typically points to them guarding a solid working theory that simply needs more time before seeing the light of day. Fast forward to March 13th, 2026, and Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed that his team thinks Nancy Guthrie was hunted down on purpose, claiming they have the core reason locked down and are aggressively chasing leads, all while keeping their prime suspects completely under wraps. That specific phrasing screams volumes about where things stand right now. Detectives are definitely not fumbling around in the dark anymore. They are operating with a decent chunk of the puzzle solved. Unfortunately, that half-truth stage is absolute torture for the grieving loved ones. The minute authorities clearly signal they are holding back major details, everyone remotely attached to the victim gets trapped inside a suffocating mental pressure cooker. On camera, they keep begging for tips. For the news crews, they tread incredibly lightly. On the surface, they dodge any statements that might derail the actual manhunt. Yet behind closed doors, they are obsessively analyzing the cops' attitudes, the shifting schedules, the things left unsaid, and that terrifying moment when the police suddenly pivot from generic inquiries to incredibly pointed interrogations. This exact dynamic explains why Savannah, stepping up to the microphone, carries such a massive, heartbreaking weight. She was not simply shouting into an empty room. She was making pleas while the very foundation of the investigation shifted constantly beneath her feet. In the beginning, the relatives focused entirely on a desperate rescue mission. Out of nowhere, those bizarre extortion threats dropped. Soon after, the bounty for information skyrocketed. Eventually, she faced the cameras to admit her mom might actually be gone forever, stubbornly clinging to a tiny sliver of optimism. Anyone can track that tragic evolution through the news clippings, painting a vivid picture of a crisis morphing right before our eyes. Hold on for a second, because the focus shifts right here from a single crime into a devastating psychological roller coaster. Day one, the devastated household pours all their energy into getting their person back safely. Next, they desperately attempt to open a dialogue with the kidnappers. Ultimately, they are left bracing for the worst if the investigation suddenly hits an absolute brick wall. Things take a much more sinister turn, leaving them to endure whatever dark theories detectives might be sitting on behind closed doors. Savannah seems to be navigating that exact same agonizing headspace right now. We are not talking about formal charges or open accusations. Just a daughter trapped in a nightmare that clearly goes way beyond some random home invasion. Once the cops start throwing around words like motive or targeted and keep digging into forensic DNA evidence, the whole game changes. Add in rumors of co-conspirators and weird glitches like local internet outages, and suddenly the investigation feels incredibly calculated and deeply personal all at once. This explains why the victim's innermost circle remains permanently anchored at the very heart of the investigation. Law enforcement might have officially cleared the relatives, yet public records still show detectives tore through their lives, turning their properties upside down, scouring vehicles, cell phones, and hard drives before backing off, which frankly makes the narrative incredibly messy. The family is totally off the suspect list, yet they remain locked dead center inside the most critical time frame of the mystery. Living with that paradox is absolutely soul-crushing when you actually stop to consider the psychological toll. You might be exonerated, but those last crucial hours are inextricably tied to you, even if nobody thinks you did it. Every critical moment still hinges on your evening meal, your car ride, your casual chats, your whereabouts, your electronics, and your sanctuary, which obviously does not equate to criminal behavior. It absolutely generates an unbearable amount of stress, and that heavy anxiety is precisely what audiences have been catching in Savannah's tone all along. Here's exactly where Annie's connection to the narrative takes a profoundly unsettling turn. Nobody is pointing to any hard evidence suggesting she knew about foul play, because none exists. Yet she sits in a spot that viewers simply cannot gloss over. We are not talking about some long-lost cousin or a random bystander who wandered into the picture after the fact. She belongs to that ultimate inner circle, standing right there on the front lines during those initial cries for help. She was an integral part of the tight-knit crew facing the media, living right in the household that drew massive police scrutiny long before the cops finally backed off. All of this explains why the central mystery absolutely refuses to die down. What could possibly make Savannah look like her sheer terror was suddenly being directed at her own inner circle? She never actually came out and explicitly stated it, but the sheer mechanics of the investigation make it impossible to ignore that very dark thought. A guy in a disguise points to a break-in. The relative's schedule provides the perfect opening, and the authorities claiming it was a hit establishes the motive. The absolute dead air from the detectives proves they are hiding massive pieces of the puzzle. Furthermore, Savannah's shifting narrative serves as a huge emotional tell that Nancy's inner circle was likely wrestling with a reality far more twisted than anyone realized. This identical dynamic is precisely what keeps Tommaso so firmly entrenched in the story, too. Nobody has officially labeled him a person of interest, but he represents the final shred of normalcy right before everything descended into pure chaos. The media has repeatedly confirmed that Nancy sharing a meal with Annie and Tommaso, followed by him giving her a ride back, sits right on the cliff edge of her vanishing. With detectives openly branding this a deliberate hit, that specific time frame becomes absolutely crucial, regardless of whether it actually points to foul play. If the perpetrator managed to execute their plan flawlessly, and assuming the ambush was calculated while cops are still chasing down those weird electronic blackouts, add biological evidence and suspected co-conspirators to the mix, and people naturally start wondering if the guy caught on camera was just the final domino in a massive leak of private intel, which is truly the most terrifying scenario. It goes way beyond a random break-in at Nancy's place. It implies the attacker showed up armed with flawless inside knowledge to strike at the exact perfect second on the perfect evening against the perfect target. This is the exact reason our film continuously loops back to analyzing every statement, every pause, and every ticking clock. Whenever the official press briefings leave out massive chunks of the actual story, you start hearing the extreme stress bleeding through the cracks. Observing the family's body language reveals just how suffocating this ordeal has gotten away from the cameras. Allow me to pose a serious question as we dive deeper into this mess. Assuming the detectives are confident they finally figured out the real motive behind Nancy's abduction, yet they still refuse to lay their cards on the table for the media, you have to wonder who in this tight circle is already being crushed by the reality of that secret. The next chapter of this investigation moves far beyond the simple question of who done it. It focuses entirely on the devastation of a household watching the horrific truth inch closer while it still hides stubbornly in the shadows. Fast forward to now, and the narrative isn't driven by media headlines at all. It is completely controlled by whatever massive secrets law enforcement is guarding. That specific limbo is exactly what makes living through a tragedy like this pure, unadulterated torture for the victims involved. There is a massive distinction between a trail going totally cold and an investigation being tightly guarded. One just feels like a hollow dead end. A tightly managed investigation, however, is suffocatingly dense with buried evidence and active theories, with the actual truth hovering agonizingly out of sight. The current state of this probe really gives off that exact vibe. According to Sheriff Chris Nanos, detectives suspect this was a calculated hit against Nancy, claiming they have figured out the underlying motive and are relentlessly chasing down clues without publicly naming any suspects. The sheriff added that lab techs are still running tests on a blend of genetic material recovered from the crime scene, hoping it provides a massive turning point. Try to picture the heavy burden resting on her relatives, not like some Hollywood thriller, but in brutal reality, meaning they face immense stress every time they step in front of a camera. Each word they utter must carefully satisfy a dual audience simultaneously. True crime sleuths hunting for hints, and cops desperate to keep their investigation perfectly intact. Furthermore, putting on a brave face gets exhausting, since optimism stops being purely about feelings. It morphs into a calculated strategy, with her loved ones continuing to beg for assistance, promoting the cash bounty, and urging witnesses to finally speak up. This happens even while the phrasing used by law enforcement has taken on a much grimmer and highly specific tone. The Federal Bureau's financial incentive has been officially announced at $100,000. Meanwhile, the massive fund raised by her loved ones is said to have hit the $1 million mark. This dynamic perfectly explains why Savannah remains the beating heart of this tragic saga, even though she is neither a detective nor a person of interest. She holds no smoking gun, yet she serves as the primary lens through which everyday people experience the raw, shifting feelings surrounding the ordeal. That emotional climate has definitely shifted, transitioning from desperate cries for a safe rescue to pleas that felt more like bargaining. Eventually, those messages morphed into the heartbreaking sound of a child clinging to optimism while slowly accepting the grim reality that her mom was gone for good. That subtle evolution is exactly why observers began analyzing her spoken words with such intense scrutiny right from the jump. At this point, the narrative takes an incredibly dark and weighty turn. Once cops declared the attack was premeditated, folks stopped merely asking for the identity of the attacker. The mystery pivots to asking what intel the perpetrator possessed beforehand, which casts a huge spotlight right back onto the innermost circle of people surrounding Nancy. This renewed focus does not imply undeniable proof of an inside job, but rather acknowledges that calculated hits rely entirely on insider knowledge. The culprit has to be familiar with the victim, closely track their daily habits, and spot their exact weak points. The attacker inevitably understands the perfect time frame to strike. That logic explains why investigators scoured the properties, cars, mobile devices, and laptops belonging to relatives before officially clearing them of suspicion. Grasping that concept makes the palpable friction surrounding Annie and Tommaso make a lot more sense, seeing them not as guilty parties, but as inevitable focal points of stress. Tommaso remains forever anchored to the last documented window of normalcy in Nancy's routine. He was there for the evening meal, the car ride back, the drop-off, and that critical transition into the dangerous time frame that came next. Annie is similarly connected to that ultimate inner loop, the initial desperate broadcasts, and the home that sparked intense public suspicion right before detectives told everyone to back off. Although her relatives have been totally cleared, those undeniable pieces of the chronological puzzle refuse to fade away. Those details form the foundational framework of the investigation, which is why pointing a finger at the disguised intruder falls short of a complete explanation. Back when this nightmare started, that face covering felt like the entire puzzle, but today it just feels like the absolute tip of the iceberg. If detectives are genuinely hunting for co-conspirators and looking into weird internet outages on her street that evening, this enigma expands way beyond a single doorbell camera snapshot. This evidence strongly points toward a much darker reality. The offense likely required serious premeditation, tech-savvy skills, and teamwork far beyond the lone figure caught on tape, which drags us right back to the most terrifying variation of the central mystery driving this entire film. Could it be that Savannah was actually dreading something far worse than just a random prowler lurking in the yard? What if her growing nightmare became the haunting realization that the actual plot involved people sitting uncomfortably close to Nancy, an ugly truth nobody wanted to face? To be clear, this does not imply that Annie was aware of anything, nor does it point the finger at Tommaso. It also firmly does not suggest her relatives played a secret role. Rather, the very nature of the evidence continuously shoves a horrific theory right back into the spotlight. The killer likely operated on insider intel, and Nancy's tightest circle represents the final known pathway where those sensitive details might have slipped out. And perhaps that specific underlying reality is the core issue. It explains why this tragedy feels incredibly unresolved despite constant press briefings, especially since the police have never actually claimed they are clueless. Their official statements are honestly far more disturbing, hinting that they hold crucial fragments of the puzzle and strongly suspect a clear motive. Cops firmly insist Nancy was singled out, continue to run genetic swabs, and keep sounding the alarm that the perpetrator remains an active threat to society. However, they refuse to hand over the complete playbook to the masses, and dealing with that level of secrecy is absolute torture for her loved ones. It forces you to mourn while trapped in a state of limbo, but it is not a peaceful kind of unknown. You suffer through the heartache knowing a clear outline of the truth exists, a terrifying picture that the detectives can see much more clearly than you ever will. It's a vibe that everyone senses, even if they can't quite wrap their heads around the full picture. Being stuck in that intense emotional headspace shifts how folks talk, the way they pause, and even how they stick together. It doesn't always blow up into a massive public falling out, but often morphs into a quiet kind of tension, where careful words sound fiercely protective on the outside, but reek of pure dread deep down. That is the exact heavy vibe this entire ordeal leaves in its wake. We aren't looking at a neatly tied up mystery, but rather a suffocatingly tense environment, a nagging feeling that the cops are sitting on that one crucial puzzle piece that would finally make everything make sense. Until they drop that bombshell, the most deeply unsettling aspect of the Nancy Guthrie investigation might not even be that creepy footage of the masked guy. The real torment lies in knowing the detectives probably have it all figured out behind closed doors, leaving the family and the rest of us chasing ghosts in the timeline, fixating on who had access, the deafening quiet, and statements that shifted for a very specific reason. Now, the investigation hits its most brutal, definitive phase yet. This isn't happening just because we finally got the whole truth handed to us on a silver platter. It is because folks have seen enough to realize those initial breadcrumbs were never going to crack this thing wide open by themselves, like those infamous gloves. For a hot minute, that discovery felt like the smoking gun we'd all been waiting for. Detectives stumbled upon some black gloves roughly 2 miles from Nancy's house. They looked like a dead ringer for the ones rocked by the shadowy figure on the ring camera. However, when early March rolled around, the cops dropped the news that DNA from at least one glove traced back to a local diner employee who had absolutely zero to do with the crime. Meanwhile, the lab guys are still crunching the numbers on the rest of the genetic material from the scene, which is huge for two very clear reasons. Number one, it proves just how twisted and full of red herrings this whole nightmare has been right out of the gate. Even the absolute craziest movie-level clues didn't actually lead down the paths that armchair detectives swore they would. Number two, it drags the narrative right back to that incredibly grim reality we've been dancing around since day one. This won't be wrapped up by a single slip-up, a lost item, or a lucky video clip. If the public ever actually gets an answer, it'll only come from painstakingly rebuilding an entire web of motives, precise timelines, physical access, scrambled tech trails, and whatever invisible thread the cops think ties the whole mess together. That is exactly why the absolute radio silence from the police department weighs so heavily on everyone right now. To be completely fair, Sheriff Chris Nanos hasn't sounded like a guy grasping at straws. He speaks like a man fiercely protecting a rock-solid working theory. He flat out stated that his team is convinced Nancy was a specific mark. They think they've figured out the motive. They're hunting down potential partners in crime, and they are still sorting through a massive jumble of genetic evidence left behind. Yet, despite all that, they haven't named a single suspect, and we're sitting here totally in the dark more than 6 agonizing weeks after she disappeared. That kind of limbo is sheer torture for her loved ones, hinting that the net is closing in, but the target is still hidden in the shadows. It suggests the detectives already see the full picture taking shape, while Nancy's inner circle remains utterly paralyzed by the trauma of not knowing who to point the finger at. When things get that intense, trying to decode the dynamics between everyone involved becomes practically impossible for an outsider. Sure, the united front they put on for the cameras is likely genuine, and that heartbreaking public sorrow is absolutely real. But bubbling right under the surface, an entirely different beast starts taking over, driven purely by the crushing weight of knowing just pieces of the puzzle. Which brings us right back to Savannah every single time. Not because she broke the case wide open, but because she's basically been the emotional thermometer for how drastically things shifted. Her family's desperate appeals went from frantic search and rescue mode to hostage negotiations, eventually landing in this gut-wrenching space between holding out hope and bracing for the worst. The bounty they offered skyrocketed out of nowhere, right as Savannah practically begged anyone holding onto a shred of info to please spill it. We aren't just looking at routine press briefings. These are raw, emotional red flags showing that her tight-knit crew was desperately adjusting to a reality that was getting much bleaker, incredibly calculated, and way too uncomfortably close to home as the days ticked by, which totally explains why the rumors surrounding her sister just won't die down. Let's set the record straight right now. There's absolutely zero hard evidence out there suggesting Annie had a clue about anything shady going down, and the authorities even went on the record to clear the family's name after tearing through their houses, cars, cell phones, and laptops. Still, getting your name officially cleared doesn't instantly wipe you from the heavy emotional baggage tied to the investigation, leaving Annie permanently cemented in that innermost circle, acting as a face for those initial tearful press conferences and representing the final normal moments of Nancy's day-to-day routine that the cops heavily scrutinized before pivoting their focus. You can basically say the exact same thing about Tommaso's presence in the public eye. The crazy details that thrust him into the spotlight weren't necessarily pointing fingers at him for doing something wrong. It was all about where he was standing on the chessboard. That ride home became the most important moment in the entire investigation, the last bridge between an ordinary evening and the darkness that swallowed her hours later. Meanwhile, Savannah, the daughter who stepped forward as the family's voice, slowly shifted her language from "bring her home" to "my mother may already be gone." She never pointed a finger directly at her own sister, but that shift did not need an accusation to say something deeply unsettling. Annie gradually disappeared from the media spotlight. Right around the same time, detectives began canvassing the street where she and Tommaso lived. This episode is not about who was wearing the disguise. It is about who handed that person the blueprint to carry out the crime. A coordinated attack cannot happen without inside information. Schedules, blind spots, security layouts, and the exact window when the victim was completely alone. The operative on camera may never have set foot in that house before. That kind of knowledge travels through quieter, more invisible channels. The lesson this case forces on all of us is simple and brutal. Never let a viral image decide the entire direction of an investigation. The figure on the porch may have been nothing more than the final move in a game planned by someone who never once stepped into the frame. Nancy Guthrie has still not been found. No one has been charged. But this investigation is active, moving forward every single day. If you know anything about this case, contact the federal tip line immediately. your identity will be fully protected. This is Behind Dark Crime, where we never stop at the surface, because the truth almost always hides in the places no one dares to look. Police officially cleared Nancy Guthrie's entire family, then turned around and searched their homes from top to bottom. Both of those facts are true at the same time, and the space between them is where the darkest truth of this case lives. From day one, the public was locked onto a single image, a disguised intruder caught on the doorbell camera outside her front door. But on March 13th, 2026, Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed what investigators had suspected for weeks. This was a calculated hit. They believe they know exactly why Nancy was targeted. They are just not telling the rest of us yet. Her last confirmed sighting was the evening of January 31st, a dinner shared with her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tommaso, who then drove her home.